The next presenter is Suzanna Sherry. She is the Herman O. Lowenstein Professor of Law Emerita at Vanderbilt Law School. She's published 3 scholarly books, 4 textbooks, more than 80 articles and book chapters on a broad range of constitutional issues in federal court jurisdiction. She's a graduate of Middlebury College and the University of Chicago Law School. She's written a lot on the topic that she's going to speak about, and I've used her articles in the course I teach on anti-Semitism, the Holocaust and the law, and I think you're going to enjoy her speech very much. Let me just...
I'm here and I'm unmuted.
Here you are. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Steve, for that introduction, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to all of the audience. Today's program asks us to consider whether anti-Semitic influences in DEI programs can be corrected. My unequivocal answer is no. So I have to disagree with Ken Marcus that we can fix these programs. Instead, we have to get rid of them, for the simple reason that the core beliefs behind the DEI movement are incompatible with Jewish success in American society, and thus are at base anti-Semitic. So I'm going to focus not on the practice of DEI, as several of the other commentators have, but rather on its theoretical underpinnings. And my thesis is that the DEI movement necessarily and inevitably incorporates anti-Semitic beliefs. So let's start with the 2 most basic tenets of DEI. They're the same as the principles underlying critical race theory of the 1980s and 1990s and the anti-racism and woke movements of today. The first principle is a rejection of what one commentator called the universal values of the Enlightenment: objectivity, rationality, science, equality, and freedom of the individual. Instead, these Enlightenment values are seen as merely the way that whites dominate or subjugate people of color. What we think of as objective truth is merely a reflection of the biases of the people who propound that truth. And in the United States, it means that white truths and white values are privileged. Second, American society is pervaded by systemic racism, sometimes called structural racism. All whites are racist, whether they recognize it or not, and the whole society is deliberately structured by whites in ways that keep whites in power. In particular, standards of merit and of success are structured to favor whites and white values. Critical race theorists have labeled everything from linear thinking to hard work to delayed gratification, all of which contribute to success in modern society, as aspects of whiteness that should not be forced on other cultures. The DEI movement, in attributing all racial disparities to racism and discrimination, buys into both of these principles. And together, these principles explain most, if not all, of the demands of the DEI movement. So, implicit bias training is necessary to combat systemic racism. Racial diversity is a way to ensure that white values and white beliefs do not dominate. Non-white values must be included. And equity, that is, equality of results rather than equality of opportunity or anti-discrimination, can only be accomplished by removing the artificial barriers that whites call merit, such as high test scores or successful completion of required tasks. So here are some examples of these ideas in action. Numerous selective public high schools have eliminated or are being pressured to eliminate their objective admissions tests. These include Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia, which eliminated its test in favor of a holistic admissions process, which is currently being challenged in federal court. Lowell High School in San Francisco, which first instituted and then abandoned a lottery system. Lowell, in fact, recently brought back objective admissions tests after several school board members lost recall elections and the number of first-year students receiving D's or F's triple, and Stuyvesant High School in New York City, which so far has resisted numerous calls to change its admission standards. Many colleges and universities are following suit by making SAT or ACT tests optional for applicants. Many colleges and universities are also requiring candidates for faculty positions or for tenure or promotion within the university to submit what they call diversity statements that detail how they and their work advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. At Berkeley, some candidates are rejected purely on the basis of the insufficiency of the diversity statements without any consideration of the quality of their actual scholarship or teaching. Some professional academic organizations, including a major psychology organization, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, are now requiring those who want to give talks at the organization's annual meeting to, quote, indicate how their presentation advances the equity and anti-racism goals of the organization. In line with DEI beliefs, scholars are judged by their commitment to DEI goals instead of by the merit of their work, because we can't judge merit. Also consider the calls for a new K-12 mathematics curriculum, which again has already been adopted in some places. It was developed as a response to the achievement gap between Black and white students in STEM fields. The new curriculum evaluates students not by whether they get the right answer or learn the material, but instead by whether they are eager to learn. Getting the right answer is a white thing and therefore racist. Eagerness to learn is neutral and therefore anti-racist and inclusive. Then there's a recent guest lecture scheduled by the University of Oregon Physics Department. The lecture, titled Scientists versus Science, Race, Gender, and Anti-Intellectualism in Science, was advertised thusly, and this here I quote, Black thought can help us free science from the white supremacist traditions of scientists. Scientists versus Science will use Black feminist and anti-colonialist analyses to show that white supremacy is a total epistemic system that affects even our most, quote, objective areas of knowledge production. The talk hinges on the development of the concept of white empiricism, which I introduced to give a name to the way that anti-intellectual white supremacy plays a role in physicists' analysis of empirical data. This lecture thus exemplifies DEI's underlying belief that race is everything. Even claims of knowledge or scientific expertise cannot be evaluated apart from the race of those who claim to know. These are just a few examples of DEI in action. Other panelists have identified many more that are more directly tied to academia. But I provide these examples merely to illustrate DEI's underlying belief that all whites are racist, that all of society is structured to keep whites in power and people of color subjugated, and that all racial disparities are the result of structural or systemic racism. My primary focus is on the implications of those beliefs. The notion that our society is systematically racist, structured by whites to keep whites in power, is problematic when it comes to Jews, and not coincidentally to Asian Americans for largely the same reasons. The problem is that Jews and some groups of Asian Americans outperform non-Jewish whites on just about every measure of success: educational attainment, income, career status, family integrity, lack of criminality, and I could go on and on. Jews are overrepresented in law, in medicine, and in higher education. Asian Americans are overrepresented in STEM fields. And this overrepresentation is despite the fact that most colleges and universities capped Jewish enrollment until a generation ago, as Stanford University recently acknowledged, and they continue to cap Asian American enrollment. A movement like DEI, which rejects the notion of objective merit and instead blames disparities in rates of success on racism, cannot explain this extraordinary Jewish success except by resort to anti-Semitic stereotypes. After all, Jews can't possibly have succeeded on their merits because there's no such thing as objective merit. Instead, there is a systematically racist power structure that ensures success for some people and not for others. But why in the world would powerful white racists structure things to allow Jews and Asian Americans to surpass them? The only possible answers to this DEI conundrum are anti-Semitic. I think there are 4 possibilities, all of them resting on traditional anti-Semitic tropes. The first possible explanation is that a Jewish conspiracy is behind America's systemic racism. It's not whites in general, but Jews who are pulling the strings and exercising power. Of course, as all of you know, claims of a Jewish conspiracy of power have a long and sordid history, including the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which seems to keep attracting believers despite its being proved a hoax over and over again. And unfortunately, these days, believers in this hoax are as likely to be progressive people of color as they are to be white supremacists. A second explanation is an alternative version of the first. It is that American culture, including its inherent racism, is actually Jewish culture. And like the claim of a Jewish conspiracy, blaming Jews for the evils of mainstream culture has a long anti-Semitic pedigree. Jews have been blamed for capitalism and, ironically, for communism. Also, ironically, Blacks have also been blamed for everything from sexual promiscuity to the drug culture. DEI adherents and their allies, of course, attribute such things as high rates of illegitimacy and drug use among some Black communities to racism, and they seem unaware that DEI itself cannot escape scapegoating Jews the same way that racists blame Blacks for the ills of American culture. A third explanation for Jewish success is that Jews are sycophants and mimics who slither their way into the white power structure through a singular focus on money and success. This too draws on long-standing anti-Semitic stereotypes. 19th century French socialist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon characterized the Jew as an intermediary, always fraudulent and parasitical. Jewish academic success in the early 20th century led one American anti-Semite to describe Jews as clever, acute, and industrious rather than able. That view was shared by academic institutions. In the first half of the 20th century, many elite colleges and universities, including most of the Ivies, introduced character as a qualification for admission, and Jews were found to be lacking in character. As late as 1950, Yale's president, Alfred Whitney Griswold, reassured alumni that the Yale man of the future would not be a, quote, beetle-proud, highly specialized intellectual, but a well-rounded man. Everyone knew, although few admitted publicly, that this was a coded reference to Yale's desire to avoid being overrun by New York City Jews. And even into the 1970s, Yale and most of the other Ivies were asking applicants for their mother's maiden name to help identify Jews with non-Jewish surnames. I should note that all of the anti-Semitic explanations for Jewish success have counterparts for Asian American success. Although I haven't focused on Asian Americans, here I can't help but point out the similarities. Long-standing stereotypes paint Asian Americans as unoriginal, uncreative mimics who succeed only because they grind away at rote tasks. Earlier this week, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to Harvard's admission process brought by Asian American plaintiffs, and in an eerie reflection of how Harvard treated Jews in the first half of the 20th century, These Asian American plaintiffs allege that Harvard is capping the number of Asian Americans it admits by rejecting them for their supposed character and personality deficiencies. Back to the possible explanations for Jewish success. The last possible explanation for Jewish success is that they are essentially pawns that powerful whites use to deflect the charge of racism. That is a way to say, see, minorities can succeed in our society. This essentially makes Jews guilty as collaborators or worse. In fact, one of the founders of critical race theory, the late Harvard law professor Derek Bell, published a story to illustrate the role of Blacks and Jews in American society. In a story called The Space Traders, space aliens offer Americans untold wealth and other benefits in exchange for allowing the aliens to take all Black Americans away with them to meet an unknown fate. One of the few groups that courageously takes a stand against the deal is the Jews, who denounce the alien proposal as genocidal and form a secret Anne Frank society to organize resistance. Sounds good? Not so fast. According to Bell's story, it turns out that Jewish motives are not so noble after all. And here again, I quote, "A concern of many Jews not contained in their official condemnations of the trade offer was that in the absence of Blacks, Jews would become the scapegoats of a racist system." End of quote. In other words, this is my language, Jews succeed only because they go along with and benefit from white racism. Now, such an explicitly anti-Semitic explanation for Jewish success, from a Harvard law professor no less, is rare, but it is one of the few explanations available if we accept the principles underlying DEI. DEI's inherent anti-Semitism thus rests on its inability to explain Jewish success without resorting to anti-Semitic stereotypes. But the implications of DEI beliefs have an even more direct link to anti-Semitism. In short, to attack meritocracy and to attribute disparities entirely to racism, as the DEI movement does, is essentially to argue that Jewish success is undeserved. And that's a patently anti-Semitic conclusion. And if Jewish and Asian American success is undeserved, those groups are fair game for attacks. So it's not a coincidence that anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence is rising sharply among those on the far left of all races, and that the majority of recent incidents of anti-Asian violence were committed by Black perpetrators. None of this should be surprising. DEI, like its cousin, critical race theory, is essentially a rejection of and attack on the principles of rationality and objectivity that underlay the European Enlightenment and ultimately formed the backbone of American democracy. And historically, attacks on the Enlightenment and on the norms of scientific objectivity have long been associated with anti-Semitism. French counter-revolutionists, German romantics, and Nazi theorists have championed an orthodoxy that rejects rationality in favor of dogmatism and have blamed Jews for undermining or resisting that orthodoxy. Today's identity politics adherents, including the champions of DEI, do the same. Indeed, John McWhorter, a Columbia University linguist and public intellectual who happens to be Black, insightfully argues that the whole movement that includes DEI, anti-racism, and wokeness is, in all but name, a religion and is trying to cleanse the society of heretics. Jews, unfortunately, have always been seen as the most heretical group of all. There's no reason to expect the religion of the woke to be any less dangerous to Jews than were its predecessors. Ironically, far-right nationalists like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers have much in common with DEI. They believe in only their own irrational truths, like the 2020 election was stolen, or in the case of DEI, that all disparities are caused by racism. And they blame the nation's problems and their own on a conspiracy of the powerful. And the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers are anti-Semitic. The only difference between them and DEI is their views on race. I want to close by emphasizing that my condemnation of DEI does not mean that we should ignore the very real racial disparities that exist in this country. But we can and should recognize the disparities and try to rectify them without necessarily assigning blame, and certainly without blaming every white person, including every Jew. DEI does exactly the opposite. It blames whites and does nothing to rectify racial disparities. Indeed, DEI may make those disparities worse. Mandatory diversity training has been shown to be harmful to race relations, increasing white resentment and backlash. Labeling all people of color as victims of white racism makes them out to be helpless pawns of powerful whites, unable to control their own lives. Watering down basic math or science education in the name of equity means that Black students will be unable to compete in STEM fields. And universities hiring more and more and more diversity administrators takes funding away from the educational mission, and that which is a mission that helps the poor and marginalized students much more than it helps those who already have advantages. And it doesn't, and hiring these administrators doesn't actually increase diversity. DEI and its kindred movements actually stand in the way of finding real solutions. To solve the problem of racial disparities, we first have to identify the causes. But DEI adherents insist, despite all evidence to the contrary, that there is one and only one cause of those disparities: systemic racism, past or present. To even suggest that anything else, including, say, Black cultural norms or Black family structures, might contribute to the disparities is taboo and leads to being labeled a racist. So DEI not only fails to address racial disparities, it prevents anyone else from doing so. In short, it isn't just dangerous to Jews, it's also dangerous to our shared goal of racial equality.